On the 4th of March, the House of Keys will choose 4 people to become members of the Legislative Council. Prior to that vote, Agenda and Perspective will be speaking with all the candidates so that you can find out more about the people that hope to become national politicians. On Perspective today, we'll hear from businessmen Ron Berry and Matt Gough. Matt joins me now in the studio.
From the start, I grew up on the island. I was a child of Baldrine, Laxey Primary School. Carried on secondary school in Douglas, and then on finishing that I worked for a couple of years in the hospitality sector over here, before running off and joining the Merchant Navy as an engineering cadet, and then doing some travel to far-flung places, moving horrible cargoes, frankly, ammonia mainly, around the world. I came back about 10 years later, ran a couple of small businesses on the island, and then ended up in the job I'm in now, working for a yacht management company, and have looked after all of the operational legislative requirements for a large fleet of super yachts since, really, in the last couple of years. We had a little bit of a shake-up in the office and moved the operational stuff to our UK office. And since then, I've been focused primarily on quality management, on ISO standards, quality, environmental, and those kind of things. I've done a huge amount of auditing over the years, close to about 350, 400 audits, I think, on board vessels and in offices around all over the place. So I've done, a huge amount of experience in shipping, with shipping regulations and those kind of things, ranging from departments in the UN, the International Maritime Organization and the International Labour Organization, and their conventions and circulars that come out of their subcommittees, down through national legislation in various jurisdictions wherever the vessels have been either registered or are operating, down through to the company requirements under things like the International Safety Management Code and the ISPS, International Ship and Port Facility Security Code, at an operational level, which is required under the conventions by a company.
So, an active former life, assuming that you got into LegCo. So, what's motivated you to stand for LegCo?
Well, I didn't know any of the MHKs. I in passing, David Ashford was in my year at St Ninians, although we were in different sides of the year and didn't have the same social groups. Other than that, I haven't met any of the current contingent until I put in an application, having looked at what the specification was, what they were looking for. It seemed like a really, really good fit for my skill set, being an experienced auditor and having worked extensively with legislation. Put in the application and got through to the applicants' conference, which was held earlier this month. I was joking at the time, it was like political speed dating, where we're all sat at tables and the MHKs are all coming round to speak to us individually. And I put my case forward and said, look, this is my skill set, I'd be interested, I think I could add value. And I was lucky enough to get a nomination and a second and the 2 other votes that were required to go through to this next stage. So
then, I suppose the next and obvious question is, what do you understand the role to be? Because there do seem to be some levels of perhaps confusion or maybe willful lack of definition in places as to what a LegCo member is supposed to do.
Quite possible. Now, I think the primary role is a scrutineering eye and an extra check on the primary legislation coming up from the Keys. Really, that would be the primary role, and that is 100% the skill set where I'm in, where I can identify holes in legislation. I'm quite good at interpreting. I can see from international stuff where the pitfalls may lie, possibly. But then there's the other aspect, of course. There's potential for being sat on committees or being with a department, and also, of course, sitting in Tynwald Court and having a vote in there, which is a more political side of things, obviously. I think on the political side of things, you're almost a dual role. So in the actual Legislative Council sittings, scrutinising legislation, my belief is you should be almost completely impartial, very objective, impartial. You should work just ethically and do what's best and provide that extra line of defence to ensure the legislation that comes through is appropriate, it serves the purpose it's intended for, it's fit for purpose, and is if it needs to be enforceable legislation, that you can enforce it. I've seen a lot over the years of legislation coming from various organisations, even the highest level at the UN, which can be full of holes, to be honest with you. Those holes can be exploited, intentionally or unintentionally, and you end up going round in a circle of amendment, which is almost like the traditional quality management model with the Plan, Do, Check, Act. But you're doing that in real time with the legislation in force, whereas the view I take of the LegCo should be that you go through that cycle before the legislation is fully passed and goes for royal assent.
And of course it is always easy to be so focused on a particular element of a piece of legislation and then potentially miss something really quite important, despite the fact that effectively there'll be 33 pairs of eyes in Keys and LegCo combined. The Attorney General's chambers will no doubt have scrutinised to the nth degree, but there are still occasions where legislation gets passed and then people notice, and of course we've had a bill correcting that just gone through Keys and LegCo recently. So how do you spot things like that? I mean, how do you approach, assuming you're elected and your first bill arrives in front of you, what is the approach that you would take? What are the things you're specifically looking for?
I mean, I would rest back on my training, which is primarily quality management principles. So the first thing you have to ask is, what's the context? What's the intended purpose? Okay, so we know that. Okay, do the clauses that have been included in the draft stage meet the intended purpose? You'd also be looking for evidence. So who are the interested stakeholders? It could be a whole island, the entire population in some cases with some legislation. It could be a very specific industry or group of people for other legislation. So I think you have to take that into account definitely when looking through. Make sure the language used is correct and appropriate. Make sure that the legislation doesn't disadvantage anyone. We of course know the Equality Act of a few years ago. Have to take that into consideration. I'd be looking, from a quality perspective, we often do an impact assessment where we identify the risks and opportunities associated with a clause or a whole document. Take all that into consideration, but also take into consideration the big picture, which is how does this sit in the context of the whole island and the other legislation that's in place? Are there any conflicts? Are there other referenced pieces of legislation or secondary pieces of legislation that would need to be amended in conjunction with a new or amended piece of primary legislation? So I think there's a huge amount to take into consideration, and it would be very specific to what was laid in front of you at the time.
obviously legislation actually follows or flows out of policy. What if the House of Keys collectively had sort of lost its mind and come forward with a piece of legislation where there were certain policies at least driving parts of the bill that you felt were fundamentally flawed? I mean, how do you wade into that policy argument, bearing in mind that Keys, of course, ultimately have the right to kick back against anything that LegCo sends to them?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, having sat in the public gallery, it's actually a very interesting experience to see how, because we don't have a party system, that an awful lot of the scrutiny does take place initially within the Keys. But if, as you have said, if everyone had lost their mind and they decided to put something through, you have to approach it with a view to doing what's best for the residents of the island. Now, of course, initially you would try to diplomatically address that and be speaking to members of both houses and seeing if something could be done about it. Ultimately, if I was truly believe in my own belief that something was not for the benefit of the island, or if something was there was something really untoward about a piece of legislation, I'd have to put a vote against it.
And of course, politics is slightly different to I suppose the world in which you've been in terms of business, in as much as there are times where politicians have to bite their tongue and go along with a particular direction, even though perhaps their head is telling them in quite profuse language that perhaps this isn't quite the right thing to be doing. How would you deal with those sorts of situations?
Well, I think you've kind of nailed it there. It's if you don't agree with something, it doesn't necessarily matter what your personal feeling is, as long as this is objectively the right thing to do. There's various various examples of things in business where you have your say, you get overruled, and you get on board, and you move things forward for the best of the whole, rather than your own personal opinion or ego on the matter. I think you've just got to get on with it. We have a democratic system where things are voted for, and one voice can't outweigh the majority. You've
described that you haven't been actively engaging with MHKs. You only know one or two of them until fairly recently, when you did the MLC speed dating session. Is that a help or a hindrance? Because some people would argue, well, actually, maybe we need a bit of political experience in LegCo.
I think the way that it's structured, you retain political experience in LegCo, because you're not replacing or potentially replacing everyone all at once. You're always going to have a level of experience retained. I've seen or I've heard various shouts from people in the community about how it seems to be undemocratic, the process. And harking back to the first part of your question, it's like, which part? What's more undemocratic? Is it schmoozing and getting in on making friends with people and hoping that they'll vote with their heart rather than their head? Or is it doing it purely on merit and not having any pre-contact in that sense? You have various people standing this time who have been in the Keys. I don't have an opinion on whether that's a good or a bad thing, but that's the system we've got. And if they get voted in, you will have experience in there. If they don't, you will still have experience in there, but you will also have some fresh thinking and fresh blood, for want of a better term.
And in terms then of your life prior to potentially becoming a member of the Legislative Council, you must have looked at the situation the Isle of Man finds itself in. Where do you think are the issues that need urgently to be addressed, and how would you go about addressing some of them?
So I think one of the main issues we face, and it's not just a Manx issue, it's a global issue, is an ageing population and a declining birth rate. So there is always going to be, and there's going to be an increasing disparity of, especially as Generation X hits retirement age. They're the children of the baby boomer generation. There will be a higher number of people relying partially on the state, and a lower number of people in working situations paying in from income tax payments. So we have to look at that, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I don't necessarily think taxation is the answer to that, although it could be in some circumstances depending on the extremities. I mean, we're talking very hypothetical here. I'm a great believer in efficiency. I think efficiency savings can solve a huge amount of problems. And when I talk about efficiency in my professional life, people can sometimes get a little twitchy and they think, oh, you're talking about cutting jobs. Well, not necessarily. Efficiency can be achieving the same results for lower cost, with less effort, so people can reapply their time in other areas that need more attention. Or it can be, for the same effort and the same cost, providing enhanced results and better services. So there's different ways of looking at that. I think, especially in the current climate of the last couple of years, I'm a big advocate of artificial intelligence helping out with it. Brilliant for anything process driven. It's not necessarily brilliant for anything opinion driven or that requires a real scrutineering eye. But I think digital transformation and adoption of AI is possibly a huge area to look at in terms of efficiencies and how we can really relocate some effort into areas that are possibly needed and aren't getting the attention they deserve because people's time is spent on process. So
then, in terms of your experience of government, I mean, have you had much involvement with government during your life so far?
As a citizen of the island, as I say, I've been up and looked at the public gallery, and I think government get quite a bad rep over here. I would encourage anyone who is really disheartened with it to maybe go and sit in the public gallery now and again, and it's quite refreshing to see that actually what needs to be done from a scrutiny and a democratic point of view, essentially, the process kind of works. It does. People are not there trying to do anything evil. They're all trying to do absolutely the best job they can for the island. There's very different opinions on what's best for the island, and people will backwards and forwards, questions and answers, and try and trip people up and then get on board with others. But that's part of the process. Without that kind of discourse, you're never going to get to the best end result.
And I mean, you mentioned there about efficiency. Is the are the systems of government that you've been involved with, you've witnessed, are they efficient, would you say, or do they
I think
need some could do better?
With that, you have to drill down into specifics on a case by case. You've got to go right into individual workflows and individual process, because that's where you make your efficiency savings. Is having a debate in the House of the Keys efficient? Well, the answer to that is a question. Does it need to be, or should it be more of a scrutiny process than a streamlined workflow? Streamlined workflows are more on the administrative side of things, I think, and that's where you can make real savings.
One of the questions, well, one of the first things that will happen if you are elected is you'll have lots of wooing phone calls from ministers asking you whether you would wish to join their departments. What's your likely response to them?
I would say that my skill set is more well suited to the scrutiny aspects and maybe some committees. That suits my auditor skill set, definitely. Although I wouldn't be against joining a department, but I would be very clear that it wouldn't be a political move. I'd be going in there to look at things like that, look at efficiencies, look at how much bureaucracy there was, see if we can make it work in a better way for the public. Not I'm not really interested in going into a full-on political. I think if you want to be a policymaker, write a manifesto, stand for the keys. That's not what the Legislative Council is, and I think my skill set suits LegCo better than it does keys. I leave the real policy making to the ministers, and the initial votes come up from that house, and we're there or the LegCo, if I was lucky enough to get in, would be there to make sure that what comes through is appropriate and make sure it's fit for purpose and can stand up.
And you've not thought about having a crack at the keys at some point?
Never say never, but I think I was, as I've said, my skill set is better placed in a scrutiny role. It's looking at that legislation. It is an audit process. You are essentially auditing documentation, and that's where I have a raft of experience.
You're going to be one of 16 names. We now are clear on that. Why Matt Gough? What's so special about you? What have you got to offer that would warrant a tick in the box from an MHK?
I honestly think the experience that I've gained over the past nearly 15 years of scrutinising international legislation and translating that into operational documents means you have to be very well versed in the way legislation is written. We work as a private business, so we're making the legislation work for our clients, albeit you've got to stay within the confines. With shipping, the shipping regulations are generally written for the merchant navy commercial cargo world. Doesn't necessarily translate to yachts, so I'll be very good at application where you look at equivalent arrangements and applying to stay within regulations but apply them in a different way. These are all transferable skills. Again, with the large amount of audit experience and being qualified to quite a high level as a lead auditor for 9001, which is the international quality standard, and 14001, the environmental standard, I'm well placed to scrutinise, to bring quality, to understand the environmental aspects. We're obliged to comply with the Paris Climate Agreement by extension. So all of these things, all very, very transferable skills. A lack of direct political experience on the island, I don't think is necessarily a bad thing.
That was businessman Matt Gough. Next, Ron Berry.
Well, my name's Ron Berry, obviously. I'm not Manx born. I'm a Mancunian, but my mother had a great love for the Isle of Man, and she used to bring us over to the island about twice a year from being a baby. And we came over once when I was 9 years of age, and she left me here. She bought a business on Prospect Hill, a sweet shop that she ran for nearly 20 years. I was enrolled in Domain Road School, and then so I consider myself Manx, really. This is my home. After college, I had a fairly varied early career in the wine trade, working for Hen and Brearley's, and then working in Yorkshire for Gilby Vintners, also in Australia for Gilby Vintners. I came back to the island and I trained as a psychiatric nurse, and then after that got into broadcasting. Went to Australia again after I got married, and then came back and started my own business. In 1990, I started a company called The Agency. The agency was started off as an advertising agency, but developed over nearly 20 years into a full-service advertising design promotions agency with a lot of blue-chip clients. I grew the business from a standing start up to $1.5 million turnover. Barclays Bank, a lot of government, different sort of divisions of government were clients. I did Swiss roadshows for 9 years with a client, with a corporate service provider, promoting the Isle of Man. And I suppose our biggest job was rebranding Manx Airlines prior to the sale along with British Midland. So that was it. I've always loved broadcasting, and I worked in radio. I started with Manx Radio in 1984. And carried on working with Manx Radio right through till going to Australia in 1987. Coming back, worked for another year, and then started the agency. In 2006, I sold the agency. I worked for 4 years inside government and was one of 5 investors that started 3FM. And took over 3FM as the majority shareholder in 2011, and grew 3FM from just a music radio station into a multimedia business. So that's it. And I sold the 3FM in 2022 and stayed on as chairman until September 23. And since then, I've been working just a little bit of concierge work, helping people relocate to the Isle of Man. So that's it in a nutshell.
Well, a large nutshell, but yes, very good. So I suppose then the obvious question, you've been around, you understand how politics works in the Isle of Man. Why on earth would you want to be a member of the Legislative Council?
Do you know, I've always had a sort of an interest in local politics. It's always been something that I've lived very close to it, and I think we all live very close to local politics. So it's something that I've had a more than just a passing interest in. I did stand for the Keys actually when I'd sold the agency against David Cannon in 2007, and did very little in terms of sort of being out on the doorstep. Miles Walker was very good. He actually told me how to run a campaign, and I didn't take any notice of it, and ended up with 25% of the vote. But I didn't live in the constituency. We had lived in Glenwillan for about 7 years at one point, but I didn't live there when I stood in the Keys. But I learned an awful lot about the process. LegCo is something that I think I looked at last time there was a LegCo election, and I was too involved in radio. I was too involved in the whole 3FM thing at the time. And now I find myself with a lot more time to actually dedicate to a project, to something, and giving back. The island's been very good to me in terms of my businesses and being able to sort of enjoy a very active working life on the island. And I think we all have a duty to, if we're in a position to put something back into the community and for the good governance of the island. So that's my main motivation.
And in terms then, I mean, obviously your skill sets you've described to a fashion. How do your experiences help you when you are engaged as a member of the Legislative Council in fulfilling the various functions you would have? What are the things that you think you can bring to the table there?
Running small businesses and starting small businesses, I think you get a great understanding of really what's required. You have to multitask. You have to be a business owner. You have to be a HR. You have to be as an employer. You are tasks with making sure the business runs. You have to understand accounts, economy. You have to understand marketing. There's a very, very broad brushstroke to running your own business. I've been fortunate enough to start more than one business, and 26 years ago started a business with my wife which still runs, the Spill the Beans coffee shop. Nice plug there. So I understand, I suppose from a small business level, what it takes effectively. One of the things that I think is very important in LegCo is the ability to be able to understand detail and fulfill that sort of role where you have if you like, a more, not more objective, but a different viewpoint from perhaps maybe what the members of the House of Keys get wrapped up in when they're bringing legislation through.
So imagine then, 3 weeks' time, you're a member of the Legislative Council, you've been successful, and you are presented with your first bill to scrutinise. What are the things that you are going to look for?
Well, I think there's a lot of reading involved. Obviously, there's a lot of understanding there. But I think mainly what you have to look at is it good law? Is it necessary? Is it effective? Is it clear? Is it coherent? Is it accessible? Is it fair? Is it easily understood? I think all of those things are very important. You will hear interviewing the candidates for LegCo the word scrutiny a lot. And I think scrutiny in this context means that it's an enhancement of the technical quality of legislation. I think that's very important. I think there's also a very important function that LegCo can fulfill between LegCo members and Keys members. It's very much a fostering of a collaborative working relationship with the members of the House of Keys.
And sometimes the members of the House of Keys will collectively do something that you think is a bit of a policy aberration. Again, if you are successful and you're in LegCo and this happens, what do you do about that?
Well, you have to stand up and be counted. I think that's important. You can't be frightened of actually sort of voicing any concerns that you might have. That's part and parcel of good law. In theory, good procedure will result in good legislation. Bad procedure risks the enactment of bad legislation. So, as a LegCo member, one has to understand that if you are making a point, that point has to be made in a very clear and concise way, and understand why you're making that point. I've never run shy of picking a phone up and talking to somebody. I think you get more done that way than you do sort of perhaps voicing concerns in a public arena.
We often hear from Keys and occasionally LegCo members that, they're just one of many, and how can they possibly manage to do anything individually when they need to be there as the collective? Well, first of all, how do you influence the collective? And secondly, is it right that as an individual politician you can't achieve much?
I think you can, and I think if you're going to go to have an effective or make effective change, you can do it from within, and that's often better. I think when we sit outside of politics, and there are so many experts out there, and I've included myself in that category from time to time. When you think, oh God, that's stupid. Having but a little bit of information, information doesn't necessarily give you a full understanding. So you have to really be in a position where you can find out more, find out what reasons are being put forward for various things that happen. So I think you can understand more from the inside than you can from the outside, and I also think that effective and good communication is probably the best route to understanding.
So the other element well, there's various elements to being a member of LegCo. One of the elements, perhaps that's a better way of putting it, is if you are successful, the evening that you are successful, you will have lots of ministers trying to woo you to get you to join their department. Where do you stand on MLCs being departmental members?
That's an interesting question, Phil, really. I mean, if you look at the function of LegCo, it's been around since medieval times, and it's changed. It's over those years, it's had to change, and it's had to adapt. But it's still there, and it still plays an important part of what the political process has to bring to the table. I think anyone is going to say to you, yes, of course, wherever I feel as though, or it's felt that I can be useful, of course. But I think, then that makes the job description, a very broad job description. So it's not just sitting in Legislative Council scrutinising legislation. It then becomes a broader brushstroke in terms of what you get involved in departments. And I think the important thing is to understand going into that is that it's really one as a non-executive role. I'm not sure about MLCs having the decision-making process in departments, but certainly as a non-executive, putting the wealth of experience that people have into the right areas is an important contribution.
And you are perhaps a rare thing in as much as you have experienced life both outside and inside of government. I guess in your various business roles you have been in contact with government, sometimes in a frustrating fashion, I guess, sometimes more successful. What is wrong with government? Or perhaps you think government's absolutely fine.
It's we have a constitution here. We have a government framework that, in its pure makeup, is quite an interesting one. I read with interest the Lord Lesvain report, and his comments were quite striking in the respect that he was quite complimentary in many respects about our structure here. We have to have, although we're a small population, we have to have, by the nature of our constitution, a government size that would be fit for purpose for a population of 8 million, let alone 85,000. And that's not because we want to have that size government. It's the way our constitution is structured and our position within the world. One can argue that it's too big. I think that any useful democracy, any good democracy anywhere in the world should, from time to time, scrutinise itself or be scrutinised and ensure that it's actually fit for purpose. So, I think government has been scrutinised, reports have been made. I think sometimes we should take more notice of what those consultants are saying. But we're doing okay.
And I guess the other thing that you will be familiar with is where the obstacles to progress are. Government has famously introduced its Our Island plan, and it has many objectives, many of which are still to be achieved. What are the obstacles to success as far as you can see in terms of how you go from a great policy idea to the policy idea being implemented?
I think there's an old saying that you can't make an omelette without cracking a few eggs. And I think what that means really is that you've got to take chances in order to get somewhere. I think sometimes our processes can hamper progression. I think there are lots and lots of great opportunities that we have on the island that perhaps are overlooked because of regulation. I don't see regulation is a bad thing. Over-regulation can hamper growth and stifle opportunity. So I think, we used to have this freedom to flourish strapline within government. I think we need to sort of look backwards in order to progress forwards. And Winston Churchill said, in order to progress forwards, you've got to look to the past. And I think that's a good philosophy. Look at what we've done in the past that was great, and see how we can implement that, wrap it up in a new jacket, and implement it today.
And you mentioned there freedom to flourish. I mean, it's fair to say that strapline had its critics, but I guess the principle, were it to be delivered, is a sound one. Absolutely.
And the island plan, the principles of the island plan, I don't think anybody could object to those at all. I think, it would be nice to see a bit more strategy in there, rather than sort of, if you like, this is what we want to do. It's how we're going to get there, and how do we measure that success.
And I suppose then in your experience, is the way in which the civil service is constructed fit for purpose? Is it good at taking those ideas and then creating work plans to actually deliver?
I think as it stands at the moment, and the way the economy is and the challenges that the island faces in a very uncertain world, I think what we have to do now is look to efficiencies. Efficiencies are very important. How can we do things better? Does government have to have so many fingers in so many pies? Government should be a facilitator. That's really the role of government, to facilitate, but also, to deliver public services, to make sure that the vulnerable are not taken advantage of, and make sure that economic growth is good, make sure our health services in good order, make sure it's a safe place to be. And we tick the box in an awful lot of those areas. But I think there is room for improvement, without a doubt.
So, there's a few big ticket items that the government has identified in our island plan. Housing was probably the key issue when it came to the last general election for the House of Keys. Do you think the progress that's been made is significant, or is it enough? Would you say that there will still be lots of people wondering how are they going to afford a house on the island?
Do you know, I've got first-hand experience of this. I've got two daughters. One lives off the island, and the other one came back to the island, thankfully, after university, and her and her boyfriend have just bought a house. And it's been difficult for them. It has been hard. But, when I actually look at some of the development that has been undertaken over the last few years, some of the developments have been quite amazing. When you look at how Ballasalla has developed, when you look at how Peel has developed, those areas have grown, and houses become more accessible. I don't know whether it becomes affordable housing. I don't know whether you were talking about public housing, but certainly from the point of view, as our population grows, and we want to grow our population, then I think we need to sort of enhance that development quicker. I think we need to be more fleet of foot with the planning process in order to ensure that we are meeting the needs of our population.
I guess that many people in business would argue that if there's a gap in the market, businesses will fill it. Why is that not happening then, perhaps, or maybe it is happening in terms of housing? I don't know.
I think it is. I think, there's one or two building companies that have really sort of made a big difference to the island. I think if you were to go back in time to the 60s and late 60s, early 70s, and had a look at what our island looked like then to what it looks like now, it's kind of unrecognisable, really, in a good way. I think in a good way. Okay,
so 16 candidates have got through to the ballot paper. You're one, and you're wanting one of the 4 seats available. So the odds are not in your favour, in as much as 16 into 4 doesn't go. What would you be saying to an MHK who was pondering the difficult question as to who they were going to pick for an MLC?
Well, I guess we're going to find out at the hustings, really. That's that's going to be the telling time on how one performs at the hustings in answering the questions that are put forward. There's a lot of great candidates there. I've looked at all the CVs. I've looked at all the people that have managed to get through to the husting stage, and there's some tough competition, without a doubt. I think a lot, from my point of view. Some of my experiences have not been as great or as enormous as some of the candidates. But I think, from my point of view, I do bring a passion for the Isle of Man. I do bring experience in small business on the island. I do understand the challenges of bringing up a family here. I understand the challenges of running a business here and making it work, and the challenges of employing people. All of those things at a local level, I think make a contribution to the progression of the island. When you've got that experience on a national and international level, I think it brings a different dynamic. And so both things are important, but from my point of view, it's very locally focused.
The Treasury Minister has found, perhaps in the last week or so, that there are often with politics lots of unpalatable answers, and you've got to pick one of them. This is particularly in relation to pensions, I'm thinking at the moment. How do you go about making an unpalatable answer, or explaining an unpalatable answer to the public?
Well, I said earlier on, I think communication is key. Even from my time working inside government, I recognise quite clearly that communication both inside and outside of government is not good. The word I used was appalling. So I think communication is key to a lot of understanding a lot of the decisions that have to be made. So I would personally improve communication, improve it greatly how those the process that those decisions are arrived at.
And does that work also in relation to Tynwald? Because effectively government has a comms team, but Tynwald doesn't have a comms team, I suppose, because Tynwald is not it's a collection of individuals. It doesn't speak with one voice in quite the same way as government.
It's, when you've got 24 individuals who all have their own ideas, I think it's to get them all on the same page. Communication is a very important part of that. My own experiences have found that some individuals are very hard to get hold of and get them to communicate. It is quite difficult from time to time. So I think that's what makes cohesive government is good communication.
Well, good luck with your candidacy.
Thank you, Phil, and thanks for the opportunity to talk to me.
That was businessman Ron Berry. While you don't have a vote, I hope you're finding it interesting listening to those who wish to represent us all in Tynwald. I'm sure your MHKs would be interested in hearing who you'd favour in the LegCo vote, even though you don't get to vote. Let me know your thoughts on the programme by contacting Phil Gaughan at manxradio.com and get in touch if you have any ideas for future shows. Don't forget this programme is available as a podcast on Manx Radio's website. I'm Phil Gaughan. Go to Myos and Geistach Rom. Thanks for listening.